Arrogant billionaire CEO yells at black lady for touching his Bugatti. Moments later, she fixes the engine. Hi there, beautiful soul. Welcome back to Stories Always, where every tale is a journey of the heart. How have you been since our last story? Grab a cup of tea and settle in, because this one is going to move you. If you've ever wondered whether love can still surprise you in a world full of judgment, then don't just listen. Feel this one. And hey, if this story stirs your heart in any way, please like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that prove kindness still wins. Now, let's begin. The rain fell in silver sheets, blurring the line between the city's glittering towers and the asphalt below. He was a man who owned the sky, and she was a woman the world was determined to keep on the ground. Until the one thing he worshipped, a $1 million machine of steel and pride, sputtered and died at her feet. The silence in Julian Croft's office was a manufactured thing, an expensive commodity purchased with triple-paned, floor-to-ceiling glass that muted the roar of the metropolis below into a distant, impotent hum. From the 52nd floor, the city was a schematic, a collection of assets and liabilities. People were pixels, cars were blood cells in a vast, predictable circulatory system. It was the only way Julian liked to see the world, from a distance, under his control. He stood before the window, not admiring the view, but commanding it. His suit, a bespoke creation of charcoal wool so dark it seemed to drink the light, was a piece of armor. Not a single thread was out of place. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Sharp jaw, eyes the color of a winter storm, and a mouth set in a permanent line of dissatisfaction. At 36, he had built an empire on calculated risks and ruthless acquisitions. But the man in the reflection looked less like a victor, and more like a beautifully curated statue. Cold, hard, and utterly alone. "The deal is closed, Mr. Croft," a disembodied voice said from the speaker on his massive desk. It was his assistant, Marianne, a woman he'd never met in person, but whose efficiency was the only thing he valued in an employee. "And the Sterling Huxley pension fund?" Julian asked, his voice low and even, betraying no emotion. He didn't turn from the window. "Liquidated, as per your instructions. The assets have been absorbed into the Croft Holdings portfolio." A flicker of something, it might have been a grim satisfaction, passed through Julian's eyes. He had just dismantled a company that had been a pillar of the community for 70 years. Thousands of pensions gone. It was a brutal move, but a necessary one for market dominance. Business wasn't personal. It was a game of numbers, and he always won. He walked over to the desk, a vast expanse of polished obsidian that reflected his severe face. On its surface, there was nothing personal. No family photos, no sentimental trinkets. There was only a phone, a monitor displaying cascading green and red numbers, and a single, perfect silver key. The key to his Bugatti Veyron. A one-of-a-kind, custom-built masterpiece of engineering and art. He picked it up, the cool metal of familiar comfort in his palm. It was the only thing he felt a genuine connection to. It was loyal. It responded to his touch. It never disappointed him. It was, in many ways, the only real relationship he had. "Clear my schedule for the rest of the day, Marianne," he said, his thumb stroking the smooth, curved logo on the key. "And have the car brought to the front entrance. I'll be driving myself to the gala tonight." "Sir, your driver is all ready." "I'll be driving myself," he repeated, a sharp edge to his tone that cut off any further protest. He needed to feel the roar of the 16-cylinder engine, to feel the G-force press him into the handcrafted leather seat. He needed to feel something. As he slipped the key into his pocket, his gaze fell upon the city again. All those people down there, living their messy, complicated, emotional lives. He pitied them. Emotion was a weakness, a liability. He had carved it out of himself long ago, and he was stronger for it. Or so he told himself, in the crushing, expensive silence of his skybound kingdom. 20 miles away, in a part of the city the skyscrapers looked down on, the air smelled of grease, rain, and history. Imani Adebayo was on her back, sliding out from under the chassis of a 1968 Triumph Bonneville. Her face was smudged with oil, a stark contrast to her bright, intelligent eyes. A single, stubborn curl had escaped her head wrap and was stuck to her cheek. She wore faded blue overalls over a simple t-shirt, the uniform of her calling. The garage was her sanctuary. It was her inheritance. Every wrench hanging on the pegboard, every oil stain on the concrete floor, told a story. They were the ghost of her father's hands, his laughter, his quiet wisdom. "An engine has a soul, Imani," he used to say, his voice a low, gentle rumble. It speaks to you. You just have to be quiet enough to listen. She was quiet now. The Triumph's engine had been whispering a sad story of neglect and a faulty carburetor. She had spent the last 3 days coaxing it back to life, cleaning, tuning, replacing. It was a delicate dance of logic and intuition. With a final twist of a spanner, she knew she was done. The soul was coming back. She slid out, sitting up with a grunt of satisfaction. The garage was small, cluttered, but alive. Tools lined the walls like surgical instruments. The air was thick with the scent of her work. But over that familiar comfort lay the cold, sharp smell of impending loss. A stack of brown envelopes sat on the workbench, each one a paper cut to her heart. Final notice. One of them screamed in red ink. The business, Adebayo & Son, was now just Adebayo, and it was failing. People didn't want to fix things anymore. They wanted to replace them. They traded classic craftsmanship for disposable technology. Her father had been a legend in the neighborhood, a man who could breathe life into any machine. But legends don't pay the bills. The bank didn't care about soul. It cared about numbers. The same numbers that were currently strangling her. Her phone buzzed, vibrating against the wooden workbench. It was her friend, Chloe. "Hey, you still on for tonight?" Chloe's voice was a cheerful burst of energy that felt a world away from the dusty garage. Imani sighed, wiping a greasy hand on a rag. "I don't know, Chloe. I should stay here. I've got the Henderson bike to finish." "Nonsense. It's one night. A catering gig. Easy money. And you get to see how the other half lives at the annual Heart of the City Gala. Plus, I need you. They're short-staffed, and you're the only person I know who won't drop a tray of champagne flutes." Easy money. The words echoed in the quiet garage. She needed it. Desperately. Enough to cover the electricity bill, maybe. Enough to buy her another week. "What do I even wear?" Imani asked, looking down at her oil-stained overalls. "They give you the uniform, silly. All black. Very chic. All you have to do is be invisible and serve tiny, unidentifiable things on toast." "Please, Imani." For me, the thought of being invisible was grimly appealing. It was better than being the woman who was about to lose her father's legacy. It was a mask of a different kind. "Okay," she said, her voice small. "Okay, I'll be there." After she hung up, she walked over to an old corkboard on the wall. Pinned amongst invoices and parts lists was a faded photograph. A smiling man with kind eyes and grease under his fingernails had his arm wrapped tightly around a little girl with big, bright eyes and a gap-toothed grin. Her father. Her. He was pointing at a tiny engine he held in his other hand, and she was looking at it with a look of pure wonder. "Never let anyone tell you what you're worth, sweet girl," his voice echoed in her memory. "Your value is in your hands and in your heart, not in their eyes." She gently touched the photo, a fresh wave of determination washing over the exhaustion. She would do this catering gig. She would do 100 of them if she had to. She would not let his dream die. She would not let them take her home. She began to clean up, her movements methodical. As she washed the grease from her hands, she looked out the small, rain-streaked window of the garage door. The sky was turning a deep, bruised purple. A storm was coming. She had no idea that miles away, a man who believed value was only something you could buy was preparing to attend the same event, stepping into a world she was about to enter as an invisible guest. Their paths, separated by class, by worldview, by the very fabric of the city, were converging like two storm fronts, destined to collide. Sometimes, we judge people based on the life we think they live, not the one they're actually fighting to survive. Have you ever been completely wrong about a first impression? Let me know your story in the comments below. The Bugatti Veyron cut through the rain-slicked streets like a predator. Inside the cockpit, Julian was cocooned in a world of his own design. The scent was of new leather and faint, clean ozone from the climate control. The sound was the deep, throaty growl of the 8.0-liter, quad-turbocharged W16 engine. A symphony of controlled violence that vibrated through the carbon fiber monocoque and into his very bones. This was his therapy. The crushing G-force as he accelerated away from a light, the whip crack of the gear shift, the absolute precision of the steering. It was a machine that obeyed his every command, an extension of his will. Here, there were no boardrooms, no negotiations, no messy human emotions. There was only the road, the rain, and the raw, beautiful power at his fingertips. He was a few blocks from the gala, the city's elite preparing to gather and trade platitudes over glasses of vintage champagne. He despised these events, but his presence was non-negotiable. It was part of maintaining the facade, of projecting the image of untouchable success. As he turned onto the private, tree-lined avenue leading to the museum hosting the event, he eased his foot off the accelerator. The engine's roar subsided to a contented purr. Up ahead, the grand entrance glowed, a warm, golden promise of luxury. Valets in sharp red jackets scurried under a vast portico, whisking away Rolls-Royces and Bentleys. Then it happened. A cough. It was so small, so alien in the meticulously engineered harmony of the engine, that he almost thought he'd imagined it. He frowned, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. He tapped the accelerator. Instead of the instantaneous surge of power he expected, the car hesitated. A sick, sputtering sound echoed from behind him. Sputter. Lurch. Sputter. Panic, cold and unfamiliar, pricked at Julian's skin. This wasn't possible. This car was perfection. It was a testament to the fact that with enough money, enough will, you could defy failure. You could build something flawless. The dashboard, once a comforting array of steady lights, now flickered with a warning icon he'd never seen before. A yellow engine symbol. A flaw in the system. No, he gritted out through clenched teeth. No, not now. Not here. The engine coughed again, a final, rattling gasp. The forward momentum bled away with terrifying speed. The purr was gone, replaced by a profound, damning silence. All he could hear now was the rhythmic drumming of the rain on the roof and the frantic, furious thumping of his own heart. The car, his million-dollar monument to control, coasted on its own inertia, drifting past the brightly lit main entrance and coming to a dead, silent stop about 50 yards down, near a discreet, unmarked service entrance half hidden by overgrown shrubbery. It was the place for catering vans and garbage disposal. The indignity of it was a physical blow. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel. A useless gesture of rage. The silence in the car was mocking him. He was trapped. Powerless. Humiliated. Under a narrow, concrete awning that did little to stop the sideways slanting rain. Imani Adebayo shivered. The thin, all-black uniform she'd been given was soaked through at the shoulders and cuffs. She had been sent on her 15-minute break, and she'd come out here to escape the suffocating heat of the kitchen and the cloying perfume of the wealthy guests. Out here, the air was clean, washed by the storm. It smelled like home. Like her garage. She watched the parade of expensive cars pull up to the main entrance. A fleeting, distant spectacle. It was another world. A world of people who would never know the gut-wrenching fear of a final notice. Who would never have to choose between fixing their brakes and buying groceries. She felt a familiar mix of resentment and weary acceptance. It was just the way things were. Her job tonight was simple. Be a ghost. Carry the trays, smile blankly, and don't make eye contact. Collect the cash at the end of the night, and pray it was enough. Her thoughts were with the Triumph back in the shop. Had she tightened the fuel line enough? Did she remember to top off the oil? Her mind was a constant checklist of mechanical details, a safe harbor from the storm of her financial worries. It was then that she saw it. A car unlike any she had ever seen in person. It was low-slung, impossibly sleek, shaped less like a car and more like a weapon. It moved with a silent, deadly grace even as it was clearly in trouble. It drifted past the main entrance, a wounded shark gliding into the shallows. She saw the brake lights flash once, then nothing. It rolled to a stop, not 20 feet from where she stood. And then she heard the sound. Every mechanic knows it. The sound of a catastrophic failure. It wasn't the dramatic explosion you see in movies. It was a quiet, final click. The sound of 1,000 interconnected parts ceasing their dance. The sound of a soul leaving a machine. Her training, her instinct, her entire being compelled her forward. She forgot about being a ghost. She forgot about the catering job, the rain, the flimsy uniform. She saw a machine in distress, and she was a doctor rushing to a patient. She stepped out from under the awning into the downpour. The rain was cold, plastering her hair to her forehead, but she barely noticed. Her eyes were fixed on the Bugatti. It was beautiful, even in its inert state. The raindrops beaded on its perfectly waxed, deep blue surface like jewels. As she got closer, the driver's side door swung open with a violent shove. A man emerged, unfolding himself from the low-slung seat. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that was now being ruined by the rain, and he radiated an aura of pure, distilled fury. He didn't even seem to notice the deluge, his eyes locked on his dead car, as if he could intimidate it back to life. Imani took another step, her head tilted. She was listening. Not to the man, not to the rain, but to the silence of the car. Her gaze drifted to the massive engine bay at the rear. She could almost feel the heat radiating from it, could almost smell the faint, acrid scent of burnt fluid under the smell of the rain. Her hand lifted, a completely unconscious gesture, her fingers outstretched as if to read the story of the car's failure through the metal skin. She wanted to feel for a vibration, for a hot spot, for any clue. She was a foot away, her fingers hovering just an inch from the gleaming bodywork, when his head snapped in her direction. His eyes, the color of ice, zeroed in on her. On her simple black uniform, her rain-soaked hair, her outstretched hand. To him, she wasn't a mechanic. She wasn't a person. She was a threat, a variable he couldn't control, a nobody daring to touch his shrine. His voice cracked through the sound of the storm like a whip. "Get your hands off my car." The words were laced with such venom, such arrogant disgust, that they struck Imani with physical force. She flinched, her hand pulling back as if burned. For a second, her blood ran cold with humiliation and anger. The ghost was supposed to be invisible, but he had seen her, and he had judged her. But then, another instinct took over, stronger than the hurt, stronger than the anger. It was the instinct of the expert, the quiet confidence of the master craftswoman. His fury was just noise. The car was the signal. She took a breath. Her eyes met his for a brief, defiant moment before she deliberately broke contact, her focus returning to the machine. She didn't need to touch it. She could see. She could hear what he couldn't. She took a slow step to the side, her eyes scanning the massive air intakes just behind the doors. From the right side, she saw it. A tiny, almost invisible wisp of white vapor, dissipating almost instantly in the rain. It was the ghost of a sound she'd heard just before the final click. A faint, high-pitched hiss. She ignored his thunderous expression, the way he stood there, drenched and simmering with rage. She ignored the part of her that wanted to shrink away or yell back. Her father's voice echoed in her head. "Listen to the engine. It always tells the truth." She turned her head back towards the furious man, but her words weren't for him. They were a diagnosis. A fact, stated with the calm, unshakable certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. "It's not your engine block," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the noise of his anger. "It's your turbocharger's vacuum hose. The main one, for the wastegate actuator. It's split. You've lost all boost pressure." She pointed a single, steady finger towards the side vent. "That's why it sputtered out. It's suffocating." The world seemed to hang suspended in that moment. The rain, his rage, her quiet statement. Julian Croft stood frozen, the insult he was about to hurl dying on his lips. He stared at her, at this woman in a cheap catering uniform, soaked to the bone, who had just diagnosed his multi-million-dollar hypercar with the casual authority of a world-class engineer. His entire worldview, a carefully constructed fortress of wealth, power, and dismissiveness, had just been breached. A bomb had indeed just landed in the middle of his life, and he had absolutely no idea what to do next. Julian's mind, a machine of rapid-fire calculations and strategic dismissals, faltered. For a full 10 seconds, he just stared at Imani, the rain plastering his expensive hair to his scalp, his suit jacket now a heavy, sodden weight. The words she'd spoken were pure gibberish to him. Turbocharger, vacuum hose, wastegate actuator, but the confidence with which she'd said them was undeniable. It was the same tone he used when closing a hostile takeover. It was the sound of certainty. His first instinct, a deeply ingrained defense mechanism, was denial. He was Julian Croft. The people who serviced his car were flown in from Molsheim, France. They wore pristine white coats and carried diagnostic computers worth more than her entire life. This woman, this caterer, standing in a puddle in the service alley of a museum, was spouting nonsense. It had to be. "Do you have any idea what you're talking about?" he snapped, his voice a low growl. It was a rhetorical question, meant to put her back in her place. He was reasserting the natural order of things. He was the billionaire, she was the help. He knew she did not. Imani didn't flinch. The initial sting of his first outburst had been cauterized by her focus. Now, his condescension was just a minor annoyance, like a fly buzzing around her workspace. She met his icy glare with a calm, level gaze. "Yes," she said simply. The lack of any further explanation was more infuriating than a lengthy argument would have been. "I do." She crossed her arms, a gesture that was both defensive and strangely authoritative. It would have started as a slight whistle on acceleration. You probably didn't notice it over the engine noise. Then a loss of power at the top end. Tonight, in this humid air, the split in the hose probably got worse, expanded. It went from a leak to a full-blown rupture. The engine's ECU would have detected a massive overboost anomaly and thrown it into limp mode to protect itself, but the failure was too catastrophic. So it just cut the fuel and shut down. It's a failsafe. Every word was a small, precise dart, puncturing his bubble of arrogant ignorance. He didn't understand the mechanics, but he understood the logic. He understood the concept of a failsafe. It was a business principle. And for the first time that night, a sliver of doubt entered his mind. He had thought he'd heard a faint, high-pitched noise on the highway earlier. He'd dismissed it as the wind. He resisted. It was all he knew how to do. "That's absurd," he said, the words feeling hollow even to him. "You looked at it for 5 seconds. You haven't even touched it." "I don't need to touch it yet," Imani replied, her patience beginning to fray. "I listened. I saw the vapor. It's a classic symptom. It's a $5 rubber hose that's just crippled a $2 million car. It happens." She shrugged, as if to say it was the most obvious thing in the world. The casualness of her diagnosis, the phrase $5 rubber hose, was a profound insult. His perfect machine, his symbol of ultimate achievement, brought down by something so mundane. It was a cosmic joke at his expense. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ripped it out, hoping for a lifeline, a return to his world of solvable problems. It was the gala organizer. "Mr. Croft? Are you all right? We saw you pull past the entrance." "My car has broken down," he bit out, turning his back on Imani as if she no longer existed. It was a deliberate act of dismissal. "Send a tow. A flatbed. Immediately. And get me a car. I don't care what it is." He hung up without waiting for a reply. He was in damage control mode. The problem wasn't the car anymore. The problem was his image. Being seen like this, stranded, helpless, was unacceptable. He needed to erase this moment. And erasing it meant erasing her. He turned back, ready to dismiss her with a crisp $100 bill for her trouble. But she was already walking away, heading back toward the concrete awning of the service entrance. She hadn't waited to be dismissed. She hadn't asked for anything. She was just leaving. That, more than anything, unsettled him. People didn't walk away from Julian Croft. They waited anxiously for his command or his charity. Imani's heart was pounding, a frantic drum against her ribs. The adrenaline from the confrontation was starting to fade, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. The sheer audacity of the man. The way he had looked at her, as if she was something he'd scraped off his shoe. She had offered him a diagnosis, a piece of her expertise, for free. It was an instinct, a professional courtesy, and he had treated it like an assault. She reached the relative shelter of the awning and leaned against the cold brick wall, taking a deep, shaky breath. The rain dripped from the hem of her cheap black trousers, forming a small puddle around her worn-out shoes. She felt the chill seep into her bones. What was she even doing? She should have just stayed quiet. Stayed invisible. That was the job. Getting involved was a mistake. Chloe suddenly appeared at the service door, holding a large black umbrella. "There you are. Your break was over 5 minutes ago. You're soaked. What happened?" Imani just shook her head, not wanting to talk about it. "Nothing. Just got caught in the rain." "Well, come on. Mrs. Davenport is demanding more of those little salmon puff things, and I can't find them anywhere." Chloe's world was back to canapes and demanding patrons. For a second, Imani wished she could retreat back into that simplicity. But her gaze was drawn back, against her will, to the man and his car. She saw him on his phone, his posture rigid with fury. He was a statue of entitled rage. She should have felt some satisfaction, some schadenfreude at his predicament. The arrogant billionaire and his broken toy. It was a perfect little morality play. But she didn't feel satisfaction. She felt a strange, frustrating pity. Not for the man, but for the machine. It was a magnificent piece of engineering, brought low by a simple, fixable problem. It was sitting there, helpless, waiting to be dragged onto a flatbed and hauled away like a corpse, all because its owner was too proud and too ignorant to listen. It offended her mechanic's soul. The engine wasn't just a collection of parts. It had a purpose. And it was being failed by the one person who was supposed to care for it. "What are you looking at?" Chloe asked, following her gaze. "Whoa, is that a Bugatti? What's it doing back here?" "It's broken," Imani said, her voice flat. "Seriously? Rich guy problems, huh?" Chloe said with a laugh. "Serves him right." Imani didn't laugh. She couldn't. She was still thinking about the vacuum hose. About the precise angle needed to reach it. About the feel of a hose clamp giving way under the pressure of a pair of pliers. Her hands almost twitched with the memory of the motion. The man, Julian, ended his call and shoved his phone back into his pocket. He looked over toward the main entrance, then back at his car. A look of utter helplessness crossed his face for a fleeting second, a crack in the marble facade. In that instant, he wasn't a titan of industry. He was just a guy, stuck in the rain, whose car wouldn't start. Imani pushed herself off the wall. "I have to go back in," she said to Chloe, but her feet didn't move. She was resisting too. Resisting the insane urge to go back there and prove him wrong. To fix his car not for him, but for the car itself. To honor her own skill. A skill he had so arrogantly dismissed. It was a stupid, prideful impulse. It was getting involved. It was everything she told herself not to do. A black town car, sleek and anonymous, pulled up to the curb near him. A driver got out and opened the rear door. Salvation had arrived for Julian Croft. He cast one last, venomous glare at the Bugatti before striding toward the waiting vehicle. He was going to leave. He was going to walk away, confirmed in his belief that she was just some crazy woman. The story would end there. The injustice of it, the dismissal of her knowledge, settled in Imani's gut like a lead weight. Her father's voice again, this time sterner. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small for what you know." She had to make a choice. Let it go, be the ghost, and swallow the bitter pill of his disrespect. Or do something reckless. Something that wasn't part of the plan. Something that could get her fired. As he reached for the handle of the town car, her voice cut through the rain once more, louder this time, edged with a frustration she could no longer contain. "You're just going to leave it? It's a 10-minute fix." He froze, his hand hovering over the door handle. He turned his head slowly, his expression one of pure disbelief. She was still there. She was still talking. And she had just challenged him. The resistance in him met the resistance in her, and in the space between them, the air crackled with a new, volatile tension. This was no longer about a broken car. It was about something far more fundamental. Julian's entire being recoiled at her words. A 10-minute fix. The audacity was staggering. It was a direct assault on the world he understood. A world where complex problems required expensive, authorized solutions. He had already called for a flatbed. His personal mechanic, a man he paid a king's ransom, would be dispatched. The system was in motion. He turned fully, letting go of the town car's handle. The rain had lessened to a persistent drizzle, clinging to the air like a shroud. He stalked back towards her, each step deliberate, menacing. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the fury simmering in his storm-colored eyes. "And I suppose," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "that you are going to perform this 10-minute miracle? With what? Your catering supplies? A bread knife and a good deal of misplaced confidence." The insult was designed to humiliate, to shrink her back into her place. But Imani had crossed a threshold. The moment she'd shouted at him, she had committed. Retreat was no longer an option. Her own pride was now on the line. "No," she said, her voice tight. With a number 2 Phillips head screwdriver, a pair of needle-nose pliers, and a foot of reinforced silicone vacuum hose. Which, I'm guessing, is not something you carry in your glove compartment. He stared at her, speechless. The specificity of her list was disarming. It wasn't a vague boast. It was a shopping list. Chloe, who had been watching this exchange with wide-eyed horror, tugged on Imani's arm. "Imani, what are you doing?" she whispered frantically. "He's going to get you fired. Let's just go." Imani gently shook her friend's arm off. She didn't take her eyes off Julian. "Look," she said, her tone shifting from defiant to pragmatic. "You can stand here in the rain, get your suit ruined, wait an hour for a tow truck to drag this masterpiece onto a flatbed like a piece of scrap, and pay a fortune for someone to tell you exactly what I just told you. Or, you can let me try to fix it." She turned to Rebecca. "Your mother has a choice to make about who she becomes during this transition. But you kids have choices too. You can let this experience make you bitter and afraid, or you can let it teach you things about strength and resilience that privileged kids never have to learn." 3 months later, Vivian received an invitation that changed everything. The envelope was cream-colored paper, expensive but not ostentatious. Inside, elegant script announced, "Helen and Adrian Bates request the pleasure of your company for an evening celebrating the first anniversary of the Bridge Builder program." The party was held in the Foundation's main conference room, transformed for the evening with photographs documenting the program's impact. Families who had rebuilt their lives after financial collapse. Children who had thrived in new schools after losing their original placements. Adults who had discovered career paths that brought satisfaction instead of just status. Vivian arrived wearing a dress she'd bought herself with money she'd earned through her own work. Not expensive, but chosen with care and worn with genuine confidence. Her children were with her, Tyler home from Rutgers for the weekend, Madison radiant in her Trinity blazer. Vivian. Helen approached, stunning in midnight blue silk that made her look like a queen holding court. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting us. Vivian gestured toward the photo displays. And thank you for believing this was possible when I couldn't see it myself. Helen smiled, not the sharp, calculated expression from their early encounters, but something warm and genuine. Would you like to know a secret? Vivian nodded. When I was growing up in Queens, there was a woman in our apartment building who used to throw parties for all the kids whose parents worked multiple jobs and couldn't afford birthday celebrations. She'd save up for months to buy decorations and cake mix, and she'd turn our dingy community room into something magical. Helen's eyes grew distant with memory. I asked her once why she did it, why she spent her own limited resources making other people's children happy. What did she say? She said that people who've been hungry know how important it is to feed others. People who've been cold know the value of warmth. And people who've been excluded know how much inclusion can transform a life. Helen met Vivian's eyes. You were excluded from my world by your own choices, Vivian. But you've used that experience to become someone who includes others. That's not justice, that's alchemy. Across the room, Rebecca Sterling was talking animatedly with Dr. Vincent about her new job as a financial counselor for families in crisis. Her daughter Sophie stood beside her, no longer angry, but proud of her mother's work. The transformation was visible in their posture, their expressions, their entire way of being in the world. Helen, Vivian said quietly, I need to tell you something I've never said properly. What's that? I was wrong about you from the beginning. But more than that, I was wrong about what strength looked like, what power meant, what it took to build something lasting. Vivian's voice grew stronger. You didn't just forgive me for striking you. You saw past who I was to who I could become. That kind of vision, it's extraordinary. Helen's smile transformed her entire face. Vivian, do you want to know the real reason I offered you this opportunity? I'm not sure I do, but tell me anyway. Because the moment you struck me, I saw myself. Not the woman I'd become, but the woman I could have been if I'd let pain and exclusion make me bitter instead of compassionate. Helen stepped closer. You were my cautionary tale, Vivian. And helping you heal was how I ensured I never became that version of myself. The revelation hit Vivian like lightning. She hadn't been Helen's project or her charity case. She'd been Helen's mirror, her reminder of what happened when power was used to diminish others instead of elevate them. So we saved each other, Vivian said wonderfully. We transformed each other, Helen corrected. And now we get to spend the rest of our lives doing the same thing for other people. As the evening wound down, Vivian found herself standing beside Adrian Bates near the Foundation's wall of impact photos. He was taller than she remembered, more commanding, but his attention was entirely focused on Helen across the room, talking with animated joy to a group of bridge builder graduates. She's remarkable, Vivian said quietly. She is. Adrian's voice carried 3 years of deep contentment. But then so are you. Vivian looked at him in surprise. When Helen first told me what she wanted to do, offering you a position instead of just destroying you, I thought she was being naive, dangerously generous. Adrian smiled. I've never been happier to be wrong about something. He gestured toward the photographs on the wall, dozens of families whose lives had been touched by the Bridge Builder program, by Vivian's work. Helen didn't just see who you could become, Vivian. She saw who you needed to become for all of these people to get the help they deserved. That's not just forgiveness, that's prophecy. As Vivian left the Foundation that night, walking through Manhattan streets that sparkled with possibility instead of threat, she realized that Helen Richardson Bates had given her something far more valuable than a job or a second chance. She had given her a life worth living. 1 year later, Vivian stood at the podium of the same ballroom where she had once delivered the most humiliating speech of her life. But this time, She was the keynote speaker at the annual Meridian Society benefit, and the woman she had become bore little resemblance to the person who had crumbled in this very space. The ballroom was packed beyond capacity, not just with Manhattan's traditional elite, but with a new generation of philanthropists and social entrepreneurs. Bridge Builder Program graduates sat beside billionaire philanthropists. Former Wall Street executives who had rebuilt their lives through service worked the crowd alongside old money society matrons. The rigid hierarchy that had once defined these gatherings had given way to something far more dynamic and inclusive. He had witnessed billion-dollar deals, signed with less gravity than Imani, now employed tightening a simple hose clamp. She worked with a focused grace that was mesmerizing. There was no wasted motion. Her hands, guided by a knowledge that seemed as natural as breathing, navigated the intricate maze of the engine bay. She didn't just see pipes and wires. She saw a system, a language. She moved with a reverence that, to Julian's astonishment, mirrored his own feelings for the car, but from a place of understanding rather than mere ownership. He found his eyes drawn not just to her hands, but to her face, illuminated in the cool, blue-white light of her phone's flashlight. He saw the absolute concentration in her dark eyes, the slight parting of her lips as she worked. This was not a job to her. It was a calling. He, who had a calling of his own, the acquisition of power and wealth, recognized the look. He had just never seen it applied to something so tangible, so real. As she reached deep into the engine to secure the new hose, the sleeve of her thin uniform jacket rode up her arm. On the inside of her wrist, the movement revealed a tattoo. It was small, discreet, and partially faded. It wasn't a flower or a symbol he recognized. It was a wrench crossed with a single, elegant feather. It was a strange, contradictory image. The heavy, industrial tool and the light, natural quill. The image snagged in his memory, pulling at a thread he hadn't touched in years. A ghost of a memory. A feather. He shook his head slightly, dismissing it. It was nothing. There, Imani said, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. She pulled her arms out of the engine bay and wiped her hands on an old rag from her toolbox. The new hose is on. It's a temporary fix. It's not a genuine Bugatti part, obviously, but it's secure. It will hold. It'll get you where you need to go. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. The challenge was complete. Now it was his turn. The moment of truth. Start it, she commanded. The order hung in the air. For a man who had never taken an order from anyone, it was a profound moment. He hesitated, his pride warring with a desperate, burgeoning hope. He wanted to believe her. He wanted the roar of that engine back, more than he wanted to be right. Slowly, he walked to the driver's door and slid into the seat. The familiar scent of leather enveloped him, but it felt different now. Foreign. He was a guest in his own car. He put his foot on the brake and pushed the start button. For a heart-stopping second, there was only the sound of the starter motor whirring. Click. Whir. Julian's heart sank. He had been a fool. And then it came. A cough, a sputter, and then a deafening, magnificent roar as all 16 cylinders fired to life at once. The engine didn't just start. It exploded into being, a triumphant, thunderous bellow that echoed through the narrow alley, shaking the very air around them. The power vibrated up through the seat, a familiar, life-affirming pulse. It was alive. Julian let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked at the dashboard. No warning lights. The dials were steady. The engine settled into a low, stable, impossibly beautiful idle. He had his power back. He turned to look at Imani. She was standing by the toolbox, a small, genuine smile of satisfaction on her face. It wasn't a smile of victory over him. It was the smile of a doctor whose patient had just been revived. In that moment, bathed in the red glow of his taillights, she looked powerful. He got out of the car, leaving the engine running. The sound was a buffer, a shield for his bruised ego. He walked over to her, his mind struggling to formulate the right words. Thank you felt inadequate. You were right felt like swallowing glass. He reached into his jacket, pulling out his wallet. It was his default solution. Money fixed everything. He took out all the cash he had, several crisp, $100 bills, and held it out to her. Here, he said, his voice stiff. For your time. Imani looked at the money in his hand. Then she looked up at his face. The small, satisfied smile vanished, replaced by a look of deep, profound disappointment. It was a look that cut him more sharply than her anger ever had. I told you, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I didn't do it for you. And I didn't do it for money. She didn't take the cash. She turned her back on him, and began to carefully place her tools back into the old, battered box. Each wrench and screwdriver was wiped clean and returned to its proper place. The finality of the gesture was absolute. She was closing the door on their interaction. Julian stood there, his hand outstretched, holding a wad of cash that now felt cheap and insulting. He had never, in his entire adult life, had someone refuse his money. It was his language, his power, his solution for everything. And she had just rendered it meaningless. He felt a wave of confusion, so potent it was almost dizzying. Who was this woman? As she snapped the lid of the toolbox shut, her sleeve rode up again. This time, Julian's eyes locked onto the tattoo, the wrench and the feather. And suddenly, the thread in his memory wasn't a thread anymore. It was a rope, pulling him back into a past he had systematically buried under layers of wealth and ruthless ambition. A small, dusty workshop, smelling of sawdust and oil. Not a garage, but a different kind of creative space. A man with kind eyes and paint-stained hands. His own father. A man he hadn't thought about in a decade. His father had been a toy maker, a creator of whimsical, handcrafted wooden toys. Julian, a boy of 10, had hated it. He'd hated the mess, the lack of ambition, the fact that his father chose to carve wooden birds instead of climbing corporate ladders. He had been ashamed of him. One day, his father had shown him a new creation. A small, wooden car with wheels that spun. "Every engine needs a soul, Jules," his father had said, his voice full of a gentle passion Julian hadn't understood. "And every creator needs a signature." He had pointed to a tiny mark burned into the underside of the wooden car. A wrench, for the mechanics of the toy, crossed with a feather, for the lightness, for the dream of it. The memory hit Julian with the force of a physical blow. He stumbled back a step, his hand lowering. The money fell from his numb fingers, scattering on the wet pavement at his feet. "Where did you get that tattoo?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. It was hoarse, unrecognizable. Imani looked up from her toolbox, startled by his change in tone. She glanced down at her wrist, instinctively covering the tattoo with her other hand. It was a private thing, a piece of her soul. "It was my father's," she said, her voice cautious. "It was his signature, his mark. He was a mechanic. He said every machine had two parts, the mechanics and the magic, the wrench and the feather." Julian's blood ran cold. It couldn't be. It was impossible. A coincidence. "Your father," Julian started, his voice strained. "What was his name?" Imani looked at him, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. Why did he care? What was this sudden, intense interest? "Why?" "Please," Julian said. The word was alien on his tongue. He had never pleaded for anything. "Please, just tell me his name." She hesitated for a long moment, studying his face. She saw that the arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate vulnerability that was far more unsettling. "David," she said quietly. His name was David Adebayo. Julian felt the ground beneath him give way. Adebayo. The name meant nothing. But the signature, the philosophy, it was his father's, transplanted into another man, another life. And then, another, more terrible memory surfaced. A memory he had suppressed with brutal efficiency. A portfolio of failing small businesses. A list of assets to be acquired and liquidated to prop up one of his early, risky ventures. It was years ago. He had been younger, more ruthless. He never looked at the names, only the numbers. One of the businesses had been a small, independent toy company that had refused a buyout offer. A company that was struggling after its founder had passed away. A company called Feather and Wrench Toys. He had crushed it. He had bought out its debt from the bank and dismantled it for its property assets, never giving the founder's family a second thought. He looked from her face, filled with a proud, guarded grief for the father she clearly adored, to the scattered $100 bills on the pavement. He hadn't just insulted her with his money. He had, in a way, been trying to pay her off with the very capital he'd built by destroying her family's legacy. He was the reason her father's dream had failed. The roar of the Bugatti's engine, once a sound of triumph, now sounded like an accusation. The weight of this hidden truth was staggering. Their connection, forged in the crucible of a broken-down car, had just been shattered by a secret he hadn't even known he was keeping. He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a caterer, or a mechanic, or an annoyance. He saw the ghost of a past he thought he had successfully outrun. And she was staring right back at him, completely unaware that she was face to face with the man who had torn her world apart. The revelation crashed through Julian with the force of a physical impact. He felt the air leave his lungs, replaced by a cold, suffocating guilt. He was the architect of her struggle. The anonymous, faceless force of capital that had shattered her father's legacy was him. The notices she was receiving, the fight she was losing, he had set the dominoes in motion years ago. The irony was so cruel, so perfectly vicious. It felt like a personalized judgment from the universe. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a mechanic, but the daughter of the man whose philosophy he had once scorned. The wrench and the feather. He had chosen the wrench, the cold mechanics of power, and discarded the feather, the soul, the dream. And here was a woman who had built her entire life around honoring both. His arrogance, his anger, all of it evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, aching shame. He couldn't tell her. The words wouldn't form. To admit it would be to confess to a crime he hadn't even known he'd committed. And he couldn't bear the look in her eyes when she finally understood who he was. So he did the only thing he could. He pivoted. "My father," Julian began, his voice strained and quiet. He was a craftsman too. A toymaker. He used to say something very similar about the soul of a creation. It was a half-truth, a deflection, but it was also the most honest thing he had said all night. He was extending a piece of his buried self, a fragile bridge across the chasm of his guilt. Imani's suspicion softened, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. She had erected a wall around herself, but his sudden, quiet vulnerability was disarming. She saw the change in him. The hard, dismissive billionaire was gone, and in his place was a man who looked haunted. "A toymaker?" she asked, her voice losing its edge. "Yes," Julian said, his gaze distant. "He worked with wood. He wasn't a very good businessman." The words came out with a hint of the old shame, but now they were tinged with something else, regret. "I didn't appreciate his work when I was younger. I thought it was frivolous." He was speaking more to himself than to her, processing a decades-old grief he had refused to acknowledge. He saw his father's kind, paint-stained hands in his mind, and for the first time, he didn't feel embarrassment. He felt loss. Imani listened, her head tilted. She, who had spent her life trying to preserve her father's legacy, could understand the weight of that relationship. She saw a flicker of a pain that mirrored her own, however different the circumstances. "My dad wasn't a great businessman either," she admitted, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "He was a great mechanic. He loved the work more than the money. He used to let people pay him in installments, or trade for repairs. The bank didn't appreciate that very much." She gestured vaguely at her simple uniform. Hence this. In that moment, they weren't a billionaire and a caterer. They were just two people, standing in a damp alley next to a ridiculously expensive car, talking about their fathers. A fragile, unexpected bond began to form in the space between them. It was a connection forged not of shared status, but of shared, half-remembered grief. The roar of the Bugatti's engine, which had been a symbol of his power, and then her skill, now seemed intrusive, too loud for the quiet intimacy of the moment. Without a word, Julian walked over and turned the car off. The sudden silence was profound, amplifying the soft sound of the city and the drip of water from the awnings. "You're good," he said, turning back to her. It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact. An admission. "You're very good." "I know," she said, but there was no arrogance in it. It was the simple, earned confidence of a master. She finally bent down and began to pick up the $100 bills he had dropped, but not with greed. She stacked them neatly, a frown on her face. "You shouldn't have this much cash on you," she admonished gently, as if speaking to a child. "It's not safe." She held the stack out to him. He didn't take it. "Keep it," he said, his voice soft. "Please. Not as a payment. As an investment. In a good mechanic." He was testing the waters, trying to find a way to help, to atone, without revealing the terrible truth. Imani hesitated, looking at the money, then at him. His eyes were different now. The icy storm had calmed, revealing something deeper, something troubled. She saw a sincerity that hadn't been there before. This money wasn't an insult anymore. It felt like an apology. She didn't know what for, but she felt it. And she needed it. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. This cash could keep the lights on in her father's garage for another month. It could buy her time. Slowly, she closed her hand around the bills. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." A strange peace settled over them. A moment of shared vulnerability. The rain had stopped completely, and a sliver of moon peeked through a break in the clouds, casting a pale, silvery light on the wet asphalt. It felt like a truce. Like healing was possible. Chloe reappeared at the service door, looking anxious. "Imani, the supervisor is asking for you. He's not happy." Reality intruded, shattering the delicate bubble they had built. Imani looked from Chloe back to Julian. "I have to go," she said. "I'm probably fired." "No, you're not," Julian said immediately, a trace of his old command returning. But this time it was in her defense. "I'll handle it." "What's his name?" "You don't have to do that." "I want to." The protective instinct in his voice was undeniable. It was a foreign feeling for him, but a powerful one. He felt a sudden, fierce urge to shield her from the consequences of her kindness to him. She gave him the supervisor's name, and he nodded. "Go back to work. Don't worry about it." She looked at him one last time, a complex mix of gratitude, confusion, and a strange, nascent trust in her eyes. She gave him a small, hesitant nod, then turned and disappeared with Chloe back into the museum, leaving Julian alone in the quiet alley with his resurrected car and his catastrophic secret. He leaned against the cool metal of the Bugatti, his mind reeling. He had to do something. He couldn't just walk away, knowing what he knew. The money was a bandage on a gaping wound. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen, not to call his driver, but to call Marianne, his ruthlessly efficient assistant. "Marianne," he said when she answered, "I need you to do something for me. I'm sending you the name of a garage. Adebayo and Son. I want you to find out which bank holds their debt. All of it. I want you to buy it. Anonymously. Use a shell corporation. I don't care what it costs. Just do it. Tonight." He was going to save her father's garage. He would be her unseen benefactor, her anonymous savior. It was a flawed, cowardly atonement, but it felt like a start. It felt like a way to fix the past without having to confess to it. For a fleeting moment, he felt a spark of something like redemption. The rest of the evening passed in a blur for Imani. She expected to be fired on the spot. Instead, the supervisor, a perpetually stressed man named Mr. Henderson, approached her with a look of awe. "Mr. Croft called me personally," he stammered. "He said you were providing him with emergency assistance. He made a very generous donation to the museum's fund in your name. He said to give you the rest of the night off." "Paid?" Imani was stunned. She spent the next hour in a daze, helping Chloe with the final cleanup, her mind replaying the scene in the alley over and over. The anger, the diagnosis, the story about his father, the quiet sadness in his eyes. He was a puzzle, a man of jarring contradictions. Arrogant and cruel one moment, vulnerable and unexpectedly kind the next. At the end of the night, Chloe dropped her off at the garage. The building looked dark and forlorn under the single buzzing street lamp. The weight of her struggle settled back onto her shoulders, but it felt lighter now. The cash in her pocket was a tangible hope. She could pay the bills. She had bought herself another month. She walked into the dark, familiar space, the smell of oil and metal welcoming her home. She switched on the lights. On her workbench, right where she'd left it that afternoon, was the stack of overdue notices. The red ink of the final notice seemed to scream at her. Her phone buzzed. It was a new text message from an unknown number. Her heart skipped a beat. It read, "I hope you got home safely. I'm glad our paths crossed. JC." A small, involuntary smile touched her lips. JC. Julian Croft. He was still a puzzle, but maybe not a dangerous one. Maybe he was just a man. Complicated and broken in his own way. She found herself texting back a simple, "I did. Thank you for everything." She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a flicker of connection to the strange, stormy man. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something unexpected. A new chapter. Her phone buzzed again, almost immediately. But this time, it wasn't a text. It was an email notification. The subject line made her blood run cold. Subject, notice of debt acquisition urgent. She opened it with trembling fingers. It was from a law firm she'd never heard of, Viridian Holdings LLC. The language was dense, legalistic, but the message was brutally clear. "Dear Ms. Adebayo, please be advised that as of 9:47 p.m. this evening, the entirety of the outstanding business debt for Adebayo and Son Garage, previously held by Metropolitan Commercial Bank, has been acquired by our client, Viridian Holdings LLC. Under the terms of the acquisition, all assets, including the property at 1458 Miller Street, are now collateral against this debt. We regret to inform you that our client has instructed us to call the loan in its entirety. Full payment is due within 24 hours, or foreclosure proceedings will commence immediately. Imani read it again, and again. The words swam before her eyes. 24 hours. It was impossible. No bank would do that. It was predatory. It was a targeted execution. And then, the final, devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Viridian Holdings. Where had she heard that name? She frantically searched the name on her phone, her heart hammering against her ribs. The search results were sparse, corporate records hidden behind layers of legal shields. But one article, a financial news piece from 2 years ago, mentioned it in passing. The aggressive expansion of Croft Holdings continues with its use of subsidiary acquisition vehicles, such as Viridian Holdings, to absorb smaller competitors. Croft Holdings. JC. The phone slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the concrete floor. The warmth in her chest turned to ice. The text message. The investment. The story about his father. It was all a lie. A sick, elaborate performance. He hadn't been saving her. He had been scoping out his target. He hadn't seen a fellow soul grieving a father. He had seen a vulnerability to be exploited. The man in the alley wasn't a potential connection. He was the executioner, sharpening his axe. He hadn't just stumbled upon her. He had hunted her down. The fragile bond, the moment of peace, the hope of healing. It was all a mirage. It shattered into a million tiny, sharp pieces. And the reality was a betrayal so profound, so personal, it stole the air from her lungs. This was the shatter point. He hadn't just broken a promise. He had weaponized her hope against her. She was not just losing her father's garage. She was losing it to the very man who had, for a fleeting, foolish moment, made her believe she wasn't alone. The silence in the garage was absolute. Imani stood frozen, the legal jargon of the email echoing in her mind. A death sentence for her father's legacy. The world tilted on its axis, the floor beneath her feet feeling unstable. Betrayal was a cold, physical thing, seeping into her bones, leaving her feeling hollowed out and profoundly, utterly stupid. Every moment from the alley replayed in her mind, now tainted and grotesque. His feigned vulnerability, his story about his father, the way he'd looked at her with something she'd mistaken for sincerity. It was all a lie, a meticulously crafted illusion to get her to lower her guard. The money in her pocket, once a symbol of hope, now felt like 30 pieces of silver. He hadn't just come to collect a debt. He had come to gloat, to witness the final moments of the legacy he was about to crush. Her first impulse was a tidal wave of pure, white-hot rage. She wanted to smash something. She wanted to drive to his glass tower and throw a wrench through his perfect, triple-paned window. She wanted to scream at him, to show him the raw, ragged wound he had torn open. But then, something else settled in. A familiar, bone-deep weariness. It was the exhaustion of a fighter who had been in the ring too long. She had fought the banks, the changing times, the slow decline of her neighborhood. Now, she was supposed to fight a billionaire who wielded corporations like weapons. It was hopeless. He had all the power. He had already won. She sank onto a dusty stool, her head in her hands. The fight went out of her, leaving a desolate, empty landscape of grief. It was over. He had taken everything. Her hope, her trust, and now her home. She looked around the garage, at the ghosts of her father's hands on every tool, at the faded photograph on the corkboard. She had failed him. The thought was more painful than any financial ruin. She sat there for what felt like hours, alone with her decision. But it didn't feel like a choice. It felt like a surrender. What could she do? Call a lawyer she couldn't afford? Plead with a man who had no heart? There were no moves left to make. The game was over. All she could do was choose how to walk off the field. With pride, or with the quiet dignity of a dream that had simply run its course. In his penthouse, Julian Croft stood before his window, the city lights spread beneath him like a carpet of scattered jewels. But for the first time, the view brought him no comfort. It felt cold, distant, meaningless. He had just received a confirmation email from Marianne. The acquisition of the Adebayo debt was complete. A feeling of profound sickness roiled in his gut. This was supposed to be his atonement. A clean, anonymous act of financial salvation. He had envisioned her receiving a notice that her debt was cleared, A mysterious miracle she would never trace back to him. He would be her silent guardian, balancing the scales of a past injustice he was too cowardly to face. But he had moved too fast. In his haste to fix things, he had used the only tools he knew: speed, aggression, and overwhelming financial force. He hadn't considered the human element. He hadn't realized that the cold, brutal efficiency of his corporation would be the first message she received. The formal, terrifying language of a hostile takeover, not the gentle relief of a debt forgiven. He had just sent a shark to rescue a drowning woman. He looked at his phone, at the last text message she'd sent. "I did. Thank you for everything." The simple, trusting words were now a searing indictment. He imagined her getting that email from Viridian Holdings. He pictured her face, the initial confusion turning to dawning horror, the trust in her eyes curdling into hatred. He hadn't saved her. He had just plunged the knife in himself. This was the reckoning. His choice. He could remain anonymous, let the soulless gears of his company grind on, and perhaps try to clean up the mess later. He could hide behind his shell corporations and his lawyers. It was the safe, logical path. The Julian Croft path. Or he could do the one thing he had spent his entire life avoiding. He could be vulnerable. He could face the consequences of his actions, both past and present. He could go to her, with no power, no leverage, and no defense, and tell her the truth. All of it. The destruction of her father's toy company. The misguided, disastrous attempt to save her garage. Everything. The thought terrified him more than any market crash. It meant admitting he was not the master of the universe, but a flawed, broken man who had caused irreparable harm. It meant standing before the one person who had, in the span of a few hours, shown him a glimpse of something real, and confessing that his entire life was built on a foundation that had destroyed hers. He picked up the silver key to his Bugatti. The engine was fixed. He could drive away from this, just as he had driven away from every other emotional entanglement in his life. He could retreat back to the safety of his skybound kingdom. But he thought of her face, illuminated by the flashlight, smiling at the revival of his engine. He thought of her hands, so capable and sure. He thought of her father's signature, the wrench and the feather, a philosophy of balance he had never understood until now. He made his choice. He would not choose pride. He would not choose avoidance. He would choose the terrifying, uncertain path of truth. He grabbed a jacket and strode out of his apartment, leaving the Bugatti key sitting on the obsidian desk. He wouldn't be driving. He would go to her on her terms, in her world. He took a taxi, a jarringly anonymous experience, and as it crossed the bridge into her side of town, he felt like he was crossing into a foreign country, a land where his currency was worthless. The first light of dawn was beginning to streak the sky, painting the clouds in shades of grey and pale pink. The single street lamp outside the garage flickered and died, as if its own work was done. Imani had made her decision. She would pack up her father's personal tools, the photograph, the few things that truly mattered. She would hand the keys over. She would walk away. There was a strange, sad peace in the surrender. She was carefully wrapping her father's favorite micrometer in an oilcloth when she heard the sound of a car door closing. Her body tensed. It was them. The lawyers, the bank agents, come to evict her at the crack of dawn. She braced herself, her jaw set, ready to face them with what little dignity she had left. The large garage door rattled as someone slid it open a few feet. A figure stooped to enter the low opening. It wasn't a lawyer in a suit. It was Julian. He looked completely out of place. He wore simple trousers and a jacket, but they looked impossibly expensive even in the dim light. His face was pale, his eyes etched with exhaustion and a deep, gut-wrenching fear. He looked nothing like the titan of industry or the arrogant car owner. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. Imani's exhaustion vanished, replaced by a surge of pure, cold fury. "Get out," she said, her voice a low, dangerous tremor. "Get out of my garage." "Imani, please," he began, taking a step forward. "You have to let me explain." "Explain what?" she shot back, her voice rising with every word. "Explain how you stood there and listened to me talk about my father, all while knowing you were the one who was going to tear down everything he built? Was that fun for you? Was it some kind of sick game?" No, it wasn't like that," he said, his voice raw with desperation. "I didn't know. Not until I saw your tattoo." He took a deep breath, and then the truth, messy and painful, came tumbling out. He told her everything. He told her about his father, the toy maker. He told her about feather and wrench toys, about the shame he'd felt as a young man, about the ruthless acquisition he'd made years ago without ever looking at the names, only the numbers. "I didn't know it was your family," he said, his voice cracking. "I swear to you I didn't. When I saw your tattoo, when you told me your father's philosophy, it all came back. And I realized what I had done." Imani listened, her arms crossed, her expression an unreadable mask of stone. Every word he spoke landed like a blow, but she didn't flinch. "And last night," he continued, his gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet her eyes. "The debt. I was trying to fix it. I was trying to make it right without having to face you with this. I was a coward. I bought the debt to make it disappear, to pay it off. I never imagined they would send you a foreclosure notice. I used a hammer when I needed a key. I broke everything. Again." He finally looked up, and his eyes were swimming with a shame so profound it was almost tangible. "I know sorry is a useless word. I know it means nothing. But I am. I am sorry for what I did to your father's company. And I am sorry for what I did to you last night. I didn't come here to ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just came to tell you the truth. And to give you this." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a single folded document. He held it out to her. It wasn't money. It was a deed. "This is the title to this property," he said quietly. "It's yours. Free and clear. The debt is gone. All of it. I'm also setting up a trust. It's already in motion, to repay the full value of your father's toy company, adjusted for inflation to you. It won't bring it back, but it's all I can do. The truth is, your father, my father, they were the rich ones. They had something real. I'm the one who's been bankrupt all along." Imani stared at the paper in his hand, then at his face. She saw no deception there. Only a man stripped bare of all his defenses, offering a desperate, inadequate restitution for a lifetime of wrongs. The rage within her began to recede, not vanishing, but making space for a vast, complicated sea of other emotions. Grief, confusion, and a tiny, reluctant flicker of empathy for the broken man standing before her. She didn't take the paper. Instead, she walked past him to the old workbench. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She picked up a simple, greasy rag. Then she walked back to him. He flinched, thinking for a second that she might strike him. But she didn't. She gently took his hand. His fingers were clean, manicured, the hands of a man who commanded, but never built. With the rag, she carefully, gently, wiped a small smudge of grease from his cheek that he must have picked up from the car the night before. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, it broke through the last of his composure. A single tear tracked its way down his face. "An engine has a soul," Imani said, her voice so quiet he could barely hear it. It was her father's phrase. "It speaks to you. You just have to be quiet enough to listen." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his. Maybe people do too. She was echoing the event from the night before. Not with a repeated line, but with a repeated theme, listening. He had failed to listen to his car. He had failed to listen to his own history. And he had failed to listen to her. Now finally he couldn't speak. He just nodded, his throat tight. She finally took the deed from his other hand. She didn't look at it. Her gaze was fixed on him. "This doesn't fix it," she said softly. It was a statement of fact, not an accusation. But it's a start. The sun was fully up now, pouring golden light through the open garage door, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was the start of a new day. For the first time, Julian didn't feel the need to command it. He was content to simply stand in its light. The resolution wasn't a dramatic embrace, or a sudden declaration of love. It was something far more fragile, and far more real. It was the beginning of a long, difficult road. It was a choice, made by both of them, to not walk away. It was a promise to keep listening. He had come to her world, and in the quiet, greasy sanctuary of her father's garage, amidst the ghosts of old machines and broken dreams, Julian Croft finally found something he had never been able to acquire before, a chance at redemption. And Imani Adebayo, who had spent her life fixing broken things, looked at the most complicated, broken man she had ever met and realized she had just been given the tools, and the time, to see if he could be fixed too. The love wouldn't be easy, but it would be built, not bought. A true partnership of the wrench and the feather, at last. Redemption often starts not with a grand gesture, but with the simple, terrifying act of telling the truth. Do you believe a person can truly make up for the mistakes of their past? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.